Good morning. Thank you for joining today's Transportation Planning Horizons. My name is Kevin Chen. First, I'd like to thank our audio and visual team for helping us webcast today's presentation live. Today's presentation is also AICP credit worthy. So if you are an AICP member, please don't forget to log into your account to take advantage of these free credits. This presentation will be recorded and saved onto our webpage for viewers to go back and watch. At any time during today's presentations, if you have any questions for our guest speaker, please send them to our email box, planning.horizons@dot.ca.gov. Introducing our guest speaker today is our Division Chief, Marlon Flournoy. Marlon?
Great, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I hope you guys are all staying safe. As Kevin mentioned, my name is Marlon Flournoy. I'm the Division Chief for the Caltrans Division of Transportation Planning. And I want to welcome you all to our November 2020 Planning Horizons. In an effort, before introducing our speaker, I just want to talk a little bit about just some of our goals surrounding climate change and reducing VMT, and strategies related to transit-oriented development, transit in general, as well as active transportation are going to be increasingly more important. And so I think today's topic is very timely, and it's on planning and policy making for transit-oriented development, transit, and active transport in California cities. Today's presentation is going to be getting into patterns of policymaking, which differ from city to city. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and just introduce our speaker, Dr. Elisa Barber, postdoctoral scholar with the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies, where she has been conducting research for the California Air Resources Board on quantification methods for California climate investment programs, as well as for the California Department of Transportation on local strategies to support transit-oriented development and implementation of SB 743. Dr. Barber, she received her PhD in 2015 and her master's in 1998 from the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of Berkeley. And her research focused on sustainability planning for transportation, land use, and the environment at the state, regional, and local levels. Before getting her PhD, she worked for 10 years as a policy analyst at the Public Policy Institute of California, conducting research on topics related to infrastructure, land use, and environmental planning and policy. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Barber. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be with you this morning. So I'll start by giving an overview of today's talk. So this is a 2-year project, and I'll start by describing the goals and methods, and then say a little bit about the context in which we've been doing the research, California policies that support transit-oriented development, or TOD, transit and active transport, or AT. We conducted a survey, so I'll tell you a little bit about that, how the methods that we used, and then our findings. And we've also been doing case studies, which are still underway, so we'll discuss some preliminary findings, and then end by drawing some conclusions about lessons learned. So here again is the email that Kevin just mentioned to you. This is where you can send in your questions or comments during this presentation. And then we'll be able to spend some time at the end discussing them. Okay, project basics. This is a 2-year Caltrans funded project through NCST, which is National Center for Sustainable Transportation. Other contributors besides myself as the team leader we have quite a large team, which includes Dr. Susan Handy at UC Davis as a co-principal investigator. And our goal has been to determine motivations, perceived obstacles, and major policies and programs that California cities have been adopting to support TOD transit and AT, and to consider how patterns of TOD, or I like to call it TOD, how TOD policymaking vary based on city characteristics. In other words, different types of cities considering their built environment, demographic, socioeconomic, and political characteristics. And then to consider how cities put together policy packages aimed at aligning and addressing multiple TOD goals at the same time. And to consider how and whether state and regional programs are supporting these local efforts. So the main research methods for the project have been an online survey and case study analysis. And we conducted the online survey last year. It was for city planning directors in the state's 4 largest metro areas. We completed the survey collection last summer, and since then have done quantitative analysis of the survey results, which is what I'm mainly going to talk about today. And then also have been doing case study research, which is ongoing and really still work in progress. So now I'd like to say a little bit about the policy context in which our work falls. So numerous policies and programs in California support TOD, transit, and AT in order to help promote the state's climate and sustainability goals. And so, of course, we could start with AB 32 and SB 32, which have established our state's targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and which have been translated into numerous implementation strategies all across the state's economy. And one of those implementation measures, of course, is SB 375, which was adopted in 2008, and that's our state's path-breaking regional planning law to help promote efficient transportation and land use through planning coordination between the state's MPOs, the regional metropolitan planning organizations, with localities in their regions. The state also created the California Climate Investment Programs, which are funded through cap and trade revenue. And a number of those provide grants for local TOD, transit, and AT improvements. And then finally, I'll just mention SB 743, adopted in 2013, which reorients how environmental review is to be conducted of development projects under CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. And I'll say a little bit more about that later because we asked some questions in our survey about 743 implementation. Now, of course, many localities also support TOD, not just the state government, for reasons that include promoting downtown reinvestment, workforce housing, and improving mobility and accessibility for residents. And localities have included infill goals in their general plans and various tools to support infill, including in particular density bonuses, coordination of environmental review, and reduced parking requirements, according to the most recent research by OPR in its annual survey findings. But there are many challenges to accomplishing TOD. Obstacles can include lack of physical capacity, near transit, difficulty assembling land parcels, infrastructure deficits. So I mean, providing services that are needed in areas where TOD development might occur, low market feasibility, inadequate financing tools, permitting and regulatory complexities, and public concerns about new development. And that's exactly the list of issues and concerns that we wanted to investigate further. Now, CARB, the California Air Resources Board, which is responsible for overseeing implementation of SB 375, recently determined in its progress report to the legislature that this law has not been achieving its goals because development patterns have been recently running counter to doing so. And in that report, CARB expressed concerns that localities have not been doing enough to support infill and TOD. Meanwhile, we've also seen the legislature taking efforts over recent years to support housing production. And those include efforts to strengthen RHNA, our fair share housing law, as well as accessory dwelling unit production, and other more assertive measures that were proposed, such as for upzoning near transit under SB 50, have garnered a good deal of controversy and were less successful in the legislature. But what all this means is that this context is one in which is a very good time to be evaluating local policy making to support TOD, to find out what's working in the view of localities and what's not working, where the barriers exist and what might be done about them. And so that's the context for our project. So now I'd just like to say a little bit about the survey, which was what we spent last year and some of this year working on. So this was an online survey in the 4 largest metro areas of city planning directors or their equivalent. The survey collection was completed last summer. We achieved a 44% response rate, with the respondent cities being pretty representative, pretty good representation based on city characteristics that we wanted to measure and consider, including regional location, share of the city land that is located within 1/4 mile of high quality transit access. So that's level of transit access in the city, activity density, which is our density measure, population plus workers per square mile, city population size, racial ethnic makeup, median income, political leanings. Now, here is a little bit more detail on those city characteristics that we measured, because we used this data not just to look at whether our survey sample was representative, but also in analyzing the results. So the transit data we obtained very gratefully from Dr. Paul Ong at UCLA, who had put this together in work for CARB, for ARB. He measured level of high quality transit service coverage in 2017-18 across the state in census block groups. And also housing unit growth in those high quality transit areas in the early part of the 2010s. And we were able to use this data to create our measure of each city's land area that is in close proximity to good quality transit. And then we got a lot of other data from the census on city population size, housing unit growth rate from 2010 to 2017, the activity density measure, jobs housing balance, median income, and resident share comprised by people of color. And then for political leanings, we got our data from the California Secretary of State, just based on the last presidential election and how city residents voted. So now I'll turn to talking about our survey findings. 66%, 2/3 of respondent cities indicated that they have adopted policies, programs, and plans or plans to support TOD, and nearly as high a share that they've adopted policies to support transit use. So this is encouraging. This means we've got widespread TOD policymaking underway in California cities. We also found overall, sort of bottom line, is that there is a lot of complexity. I mean, as we started to crunch the numbers and try to determine what types of cities are experiencing various conditions and taking various steps, policy steps, we found that motivations and perceived barriers and policy choices are quite varied, and that few of the city characteristics we measured were simple or consistent in providing explanatory factors. So it's a complex situation out there, and we tried to glean what we could about patterns and variables that help us understand, but it's a complex picture. So I'm going to start with our findings on motivations that the survey respondents indicated were most important to their city's elected leaders in adopting TOD policies and programs. The motivation considered most often as very important is improving community revitalization and livability. That's rated very important by 71% of respondents. And it's 71% of respondents across all the surveys respondents that we obtained, followed by improving mobility, accessibility, and then providing housing, both affordable housing and housing more generally. So let's stop for a minute and think about these results. I was very interested about the high share of cities that rank mobility and accessibility as very important. Now, a primary underlying concern for our whole research project is whether and how localities are making a connection between transportation and land use planning. And in that regard, this finding, I think, is quite encouraging. It shows elected leaders are indeed making a transportation land use connection. In other words, they're aware of the interconnection that exists on the ground between land use and development and travel behavior. That's because this finding here shows that they want to support TOD, infill development near transit as a transportation strategy to improve mobility and accessibility. So to investigate this further, we conducted regression analysis to determine whether any of the city characteristics that we measured could predict which cities rank mobility and accessibility as an important indication, as an important motivation. And the results, we found that democratic voter share and racial ethnic diversity were the only significant predictors after controlling for all the others that we tested. Oh, I should mention, we did also find that 3 other motivations were significantly associated with liberal political leanings when we conducted our regression analysis. Namely, the motivations to promote housing growth. I'm going to go back because that's on this slide. The motivation to promote housing growth, affordable housing, and environmental benefits. So in that case, we are seeing a discernible connection, association between certain motivations and political leanings. Housing growth motivation was also associated with a few other variables that we tested, including density and transit coverage. So more dense, more transit accessible cities are more interested in housing growth. Now, it's notable that housing growth motivation was not significantly associated with jobs housing balance, which is a suggestion that job-rich cities don't feel more pressure than others to increase housing provision. Okay, so now moving on to perceived obstacles. Here, the factor cited most frequently by our respondents as a major obstacle to TOD was lack of vacant land, which is just a physical constraint. But that was followed by difficulty in assembling land parcels, inadequate frequency of transit service, inadequate transit facilities, and then resident concerns or opposition. Now let's unpack those a little. Difficulty assembling land parcels has been a problem for cities, especially since 2012 with the dissolution of Local Government Redevelopment Authority, which, as we all know, utilized tax increment financing and was the main means by which cities had been working to revitalize deteriorated downtown areas and also to fund affordable housing because of the mandatory 20% set aside of TIF funds, tax increment funds required for that purpose. And since 2012, we've seen various legislative efforts to restore TIF authority, and that has happened to some extent, but definitely not fully restoring the lost power. So that helps explain that concern about difficulty assembling land parcels. Now, I think it's interesting that in this ranking, two factors that are often considered critical for TOD's success often get a lot of attention, but which are mainly out of the direct control of city officials, were rated less important than obstacles that are under the control of public officials. Now, what am I talking about? I mean specifically resident opposition associated with NIMBYism and lack of market interest are variables that get a lot of attention, but may not be under direct control of city officials or not easily. However, other factors, in particular inadequate transit infrastructure and service and difficulty assembling land parcels, really, you could say, are more subject to policy intervention or more directly subject to policy intervention. So I think that's an interesting finding. Now, we probed a little bit more in our survey about those two variables, market interest and resident concerns. We found that 61% of respondents, now these are respondents, cities that did tell us they have TOD policy plans and programs, indicated that market interest was at least moderate throughout their city, which is an encouraging finding. We asked respondents with adopted TOD policies, programs, and plans what share of projects in their city have generated significant concerns or opposition. So this is the NIMBYism question or concern. 19%, or about 20%, about 1 in 5, indicated most or almost all. And another 36% indicated some. So that's significant concern or barrier, that the obstacle that they need to manage. Now, logistic regression revealed that only greater transit coverage was associated with a greater likelihood of a city facing that kind of resident opposition or concern, which is in some ways a logical finding. It means that where more TOD is possible, because there's more transit access, more resident concerns are voiced. We also asked respondents what share of TOD projects in their city has generated concerns that are specifically about gentrification and displacement, because that is a topic, that has gained some attention across the state, especially with some of those assertive proposals like SB 50 that would have upzoned near transit. The concerns are that, new development will be built to appeal to the upscale housing market, and that could result in gentrification and displacement of existing low-income residents. So 30% of cities said that some or almost all or all projects have generated concerns about gentrification or displacement. And regression results showed that larger job-rich cities were the most likely to have experienced such concerns. That kind of makes sense. If you think about, for example, San Francisco, where there is a lot of pressure for commercial development, for office development. So we tried to put together some of these results, these findings, to see about how they're connected. We measured overall motivation by adding up the number of motivations considered very important to survey respondents. And then we measured overall perception of obstacles the same way by summing up the number considered major by each survey respondent. And we found an interesting pattern. Higher overall motivation for TOD policymaking across multiple goals is associated with lower perception of obstacles. So this almost says something about perception, about attitudes. And then also that association is significant with liberal political leanings among city residents. Again, this is in a regression analysis that controls for all the city characteristics I showed you. So this finding reinforces the threat of a discernible association between political ideology and motivation to promote TOD. Okay, now getting on to the hard tax. Policy adoption on the ground. For the 66% of survey respondents who told us their city has adopted policies, plans, or programs to support TOD, we asked about specific policies that they've adopted. We presented this list of 22 regulatory planning and financing measures and then asked about each one. And as that red arrow indicates, the most commonly employed strategy to promote TOD, according to the respondents, is to provide a density bonus for affordable housing development. Over 90% of cities do so. It's required by state law, so that is not terribly surprising. The second most commonly used TOD strategy is about zoning, namely mixed-use zoning. For example, through a form-based code, 3/4 of respondent cities implement this strategy. Now, the choice to upzone on a systematic basis, rather than case by case, which is how it's done through a density bonus approach, is somewhat less popular, with 65% of cities having done so. That's still 2/3 of cities with TOD policies have done that. But that's that more controversial approach where you're systematically upzoning, such as would have occurred under SB 50. And we found that the likelihood of a city having upzoned systematically was significantly associated with mobility, accessibility, and livability motivations. Again, I think that's quite interesting. That's underscoring that transportation land use connection that I was talking about. The cities that prioritize mobility and accessibility goals from their TOD policies are more likely to be the ones that are upzoning systematically. So you could consider these perhaps to be cities that are really being more aggressive about TOD. Okay, the third most commonly used strategy is adoption of specific plans, with 70% of respondent cities having done so. The fourth most common strategy, to reduce parking requirements, which, as we all know, really have a major influence on financial feasibility of development in built-up areas, as well as affecting mode choice. So that's a strategy that also really gets at that connection between development patterns and mode choices. The next most popular strategies relate to CEQA, which of course requires that all projects that seek development approval in the state be analyzed and, if feasible, mitigated for the negative environmental impacts. We saw that 55% of our respondent cities employ CEQA tiering from specific plans, which means that they develop specific plans, which then can form the basis for streamlining project evaluation subsequent to the adoption of the specific plan. So it means reducing environmental review for projects within the plan areas. And meanwhile, 53% of respondent cities also utilize other state-provided mechanisms for streamlining CEQA, because there have been various provisions that the legislature has introduced or has adopted that allow for CEQA streamlining of projects that meet certain conditions, certain infill projects. However, if you want to look at other approaches to permit streamlining, we asked whether cities have worked to facilitate permit streamlining just in relation to, local conditions of approval. That has been a less popular approach, with only 37% of cities taking such measures to expedite approval. Now, for all of the policy measures that we asked about, we conducted regression analysis to see, again, what city characteristics and also what perceived motivations and barriers are associated with adoption of these different policies. And this is where we really found few persistent patterns. The correlation among propensity to adopt each of the various strategies is generally low. And the factors that we employed as the independent variables, the city characteristics, as well as their perceived motivations and barriers, don't serve to predict adoption in any consistent way. Which is, by the way, a good reason to conduct case study research, because it lets you investigate the why more easily than you can do, through a brief set of survey questions. The why questions about why they adopt certain types of policies when they face certain conditions. So a good question is, what explains overall adoption rates? I mean, cities that are, adopting more of these policies versus less. So we created an index that simply counts how many of the strategies we inquired about have been adopted by each city, and found that only city population size and location in the Los Angeles region, which was negatively associated with adoption rates, proved to be significant predictors. Again, that was a regression that included all the characteristics as well as motivations, barriers, and level of perceived market interest. So again, here, we're not seeing really strong overall patterns that predict TOD policymaking. It's complicated, a complex situation on the ground. All right, now those graphs I showed you were a little bit hard to look at. I just wanted to show you all the policy measures, but here we're just kind of summing up the results. Here are the policies or strategies adopted by half or more of the respondent cities. Again, this is among those cities that indicated they had adopted TOD policies, plans, and or programs. So what can we conclude here? What's the sort of top level finding here from our research on what policy measures are considered most often? Now, aside from the high use of density bonuses, which is, after all, required by state law, I would say the message here is about the importance of zoning, both mixed use and upzoning, as well as specific plans and CEQA streamlining. And it's really the connection of specific plans, which include zoning provisions and can be the basis for CEQA streamlining, that appears to be the important nexus. And this conclusion was confirmed when we asked directly. We asked survey respondents about the perceived importance of adopted policies. For every city that had adopted a given policy, we asked them how important do they consider it to be for achieving their TOD goals, and respondents said zoning. is most important, both mixed use and upzoning, followed by adoption of specific plans and CEQA tiering, and then reduce parking requirements. So again, that doesn't confirm the importance of parking as an policy measure that really has some bang for the buck. It underscores the connection between local regulatory measures, specifically zoning and parking, with local plan making and CEQA. So now here, what I've done is just to put together the information on perceived importance with adoption rates, because this helps give you some idea of how influential cities feel some policies are, even if not that many cities have adopted them. Some policies like upzoning can be politically quite challenging. So it's useful to compare perception of effectiveness, even for policies that aren't adopted as often. Now, the opposite is also true. You can get a policy that's adopted, all across the board, but it isn't considered very effective. And that's what you can see here with density bonuses. You saw how the density bonus fell off of the last couple charts on perceived importance. In fact, our respondents indicated that the effectiveness is considered fairly low compared to the high adoption rate. And we think this discrepancy could reflect the fact that localities are required to adopt density bonuses under state law for developments that include affordable housing. And so the ubiquity of the measure, the very fact that it's offered all across the board, could mean that it provides less of an incentive for attracting TOD to your own city versus another. So here the arrows show you the reverse discrepancy. These are the policies that are rated more important, more influential and effective than their adoption rate might suggest, which we interpret to mean that these can be politically challenging in spite of their potential effectiveness. Now, because that was hard to see, again, since I showed all those policy measures, I have just summarized the top findings. The policies for which adoption rates are noticeably lower than perceived importance. And this discrepancy is evident for upzoning, permit streamlining in TOD zones, subsidies for affordable housing, pedestrian bicycle overlay zones, which is kind of an interesting finding, especially since we do require localities to develop multimodal street plans. Parking pricing and transportation development fees that are lowered in TOD zones among the measures that we evaluated. So note in particular the perceived importance of upzoning here, again, which has been a controversial strategy, but which is deemed very important by a very high share of localities. Now I want to turn to our survey findings on the impact of state and regional programs to support TOD. Here we're asking specifically about programs that offer grants for that purpose, and we found that half or more of respondent cities, again, among those that have adopted policies to promote TOD transit and AT, had applied for planning grants from MPOs and or Caltrans, and substantial shares had also applied for other grants from the sources we asked about. And respondents who received the grants indicated they have been quite important in helping achieve TOD goals. Especially that's been the case for MPO project grants. 85% of respondents think those are very important, and for Caltrans Sustainable Communities Planning grants, with 73% indicating they were very important. So that should be very reassuring to you at Caltrans who may be involved in that program. We also asked whether cities have officially designated TOD zones for policy support. And more than half of all survey respondents indicated their city had done so. And what we were getting at here was whether they also have designated TOD zones to coincide with the priority growth areas that have been determined in the MPO regional plans under SB 375. So whether there's been that connection made at the local policy level with the regional plans. And we found that 2/3 of cities say their own designated TOD zones coincide with the regional plans. And now findings on the impacts of SB 743. As I said earlier, I was going to talk a little bit about this. As I'm sure all of you know, SB 743 removed, which was adopted in 2013, removed level of service or LOS measures of traffic delay from CEQA as a impact to be measured for development projects that are under review. And state guidelines, which have just gone into effect this year, recommend analyzing for impacts on VMT instead. So it's kind of a substitute for a VMT for LOS, which had been long embedded, of course, LOS measures, not just as a measure used under CEQA review, but also deeply embedded in local general plans, in development impact fees, and as a measure of traffic delay. There was a concern that we really needed to substitute a different measure that would be more in line with sustainability goals at the state and local level. So the new approach kind of overturns the apple cart in terms of what sorts of projects are likely to be evaluated as causing significant negative environmental impacts, which therefore require mitigation if feasible under CEQA. Essentially, the new guidelines, streamline environmental review for low VMT projects, such as TOD, while ensuring that the higher VMT projects, such as sprawl-type low-density development, are going to be more likely to require substantial review of impacts and mitigation, which is kind of the reverse of the situation when using LOS metrics as your guide, as your standard. And this new state policy 743 could have potentially far-reaching impacts and changes for localities, not just in terms of how they conduct CEQA review, but also, what kind of transportation standards, objectives are embedded in the general plan and in impact fees. And so we wanted to investigate that as part of our survey. Now, SB 740 does not prohibit that a city continue to use LOS as part of imposed conditions of development or in impact fees. However, they just can't be pegged to achieve and keep CEQA compliance. So we asked survey respondents about this. What metrics does your city plan to employ as a basis for applying conditions of development approval? That was the question. Pursuant to SB 743. And 36% of survey respondents said they did not know. But then among those who said they did, 4/5 say their city will be using both VMT and LOS. Now, what does that mean? At least based on these results, which are a year old now, cities are going to be straddling and somehow aiming to align these potentially conflicting standards. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how they integrate LOS and VMT as criteria that they want to address in their transportation planning. We probed further on the impact that SB 743 may have on development impact fees. 68% of cities, according to our survey, had adopted development impact fees for transportation. 3/4 of those fees are multimodal, providing funds for transit, bicycle, and/or pedestrian facilities in addition to roadway improvements. And 2/3 of the adopted fees are based, at least in part, of course, on determination of auto LOS impacts and meeting auto LOS standards. Now, nearly 4/5 of cities, respondent cities, told us they either will or may revise their impact fees to align with SB 743. More specifically, about 1/3, 36%, say their city either has revised or will revise its fee, and another 43% said they may revise their fee. So this suggests that 743 could indeed start to really trigger and spill over into some interesting impacts on transportation planning in the state that we can monitor in the years to come. All right, so now here I am just showing again the email address for you to send questions and comments as we get to the last portion of my talk. So just give you a second to stare at that. I'm about to transition to talking about our case study analysis, and here the results are preliminary, and they're just more skimpy than what you've seen because the work is still underway. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we've conducted the case study analysis. We've been investigating city strategies using online documents as well as interviews. We've been interested in kind of just probing more deeply into the why questions, as I said earlier, to find out how and whether TOD policy goals align and or conflict, and what policy packages cities believe can be useful in helping align and address potentially conflicting TOD goals. So why do we pick certain types of policies given certain types of conditions and certain goals? So here I'm just going to note one of our survey findings that's pertinent to this set of questions. We asked survey takers, how difficult do your city's elected officials and planners find it to be to balance and integrate policies to promote affordable housing and other development along with multimodal transport improvements? Remember that the top motivations we found for cities adopting TOD policies were housing growth as well as mobility, accessibility, and then livability. So here we're asking, do those goals sometimes conflict? And about 1/3 said that it can be very difficult to align those goals. Another 40% somewhat difficult. So that's a pretty significant indication that it's useful to probe these questions about how to achieve multiple TOD goals. One way you could think about it in terms of, the sort of classic sustainability theory is sustainable development is often characterized as the 3 E's, trying to, achieve results for the environment, for social equity and economic development, such as through transportation investment, achieve them simultaneously. Well, so here we're getting at the nexus of how easy is it to align the 3 E's? When and if do they sometimes present conflicts that need to be addressed, that need to be managed? So here's a little bit about how we have selected our case study sample. 2 city groups. We're doing the central cities. That's actually where we put an awful lot of our effort, again, in the 4 large regions. But then we also called a strategic sample. We just looked around for recognized TOD policy leaders, but then also used our survey results to try to determine the set of cities that have the following aspects. They have high motivation for TOD policy making. This is based on the survey results, especially for mobility, accessibility, and affordable housing, that nexus that we're trying to look at. They have high adoption rates for policies that were determined to be important and influential, including upzoning, mixed-use zoning, permit streamlining, impact fees. And they intend to revise if they haven't already done so, intend to revise their city's transportation impact fee pursuant to SB 743. And then we've also, in the process of doing our case studies, ended up also looking at some corridor strategy. In other words, comparing corridor strategies across multiple jurisdictions that span that corridor, because that's actually a very interesting governance sort of perspective on policymaking, because you're comparing neighboring cities along the same corridor. So here are preliminary findings. These are very preliminary, and really what I'm going to do here is talk more about what we found in terms of challenges than tell you about the results, because we're really, that work is really still underway. So major goals for TOD for the case study cities we've been investigating have included economic development, affordable housing, and mobility and accessibility. Here I just want to note that job growth, economic development really has been an important articulated goal for the cities that we have been looking at. And, we do see very interesting tensions arising when it comes to aligning these goals. They really come, sort of boil down to jobs versus housing, and then market rate versus affordable housing. And one thing I want to note about all the cities we've been investigating is that a really widespread strategy is to support TOD along targeted transit corridors while preserving single-family neighborhoods. And we see that all across the board. I mean, even in San Francisco, 60% of land is zoned for single-family. And this represents a political compromise that, many California cities are undertaking. If we concentrate densification near transit, then we can maybe reassure existing single-family neighborhoods will not be changed. Now, however, you need to, of course, recognize that what that means is we're also concentrating controversies. If densification efforts are being made near transit, that means that's where the controversies are also going to be, focused. And we found that job centers with high TOD market interest, such as, of course, San Francisco in particular, are able to generate high impact fees to support affordable housing development due to the high market interest in commercial development. But then, that's really a double-edged sword, because high TOD land values can actually make housing financially infeasible. And so what are we seeing in San Francisco? Efforts to actually constrain commercial development, for example, in the Mission District, perhaps to prohibit commercial development in order as a strategy to actually try to save the potential for housing development. So you're really seeing a trade-off there. Now, conversely, some cities with good transit access, such as San Jose, Oakland in particular, are prioritizing job growth much more heavily as a top goal, which can, and they want that, they say, in order to provide a stronger fiscal base to gain funds for affordable housing, among other services the city wants and needs. And then further, I want to note that these cities also emphasize job growth near transit can really have important environmental benefits for improving mobility and accessibility, or let me say improving accessibility, improving transport efficiency. Now, these cities also risk losing existing affordable housing in their downtown areas in the process if they're trying to become more regional job centers. We're seeing controversies over Oakland's downtown plans, San Jose Dryden Center plans for that reason. So here again, you're just seeing that question of trade-offs, how to kind of get the right balance, the sweet spot, where you're generating impact fees that produce affordable housing, but that don't kill the goose that laid the golden egg. Now, another interesting set of trade-offs that we noticed, like in particular in LA, has to do with actually mobility and accessibility, which I have been equating, like we asked in our survey, mobility and accessibility as a goal. Well, actually, mobility and accessibility can sometimes conflict when it comes to Todd. Definitely been an issue, concern in LA, because some strategies that enhance accessibility, such as expanding transit and AT service and facilities, may actually not improve auto traffic congestion. In other words, they may produce these mobility consequences for people who continue to drive, even if transit and AT improvements can produce a mode shift away from driving for some people who formerly drove. Now they're taking transit. The ones who continue to drive, which, let's face it, in LA is by far most travelers, may not see an improvement in congestion. And this has become just a real political, hotspot, because, of course, as you know, Angelenos have supported recent sales tax measures to increase funding for transit and AT to the tune of multiple tens of billions of dollars. And research from UCLA indicates that the stated reason or motivation that many of those voters were pursuing was to reduce traffic congestion, because those sales tax measures have sometimes been billed as a way to help improve traffic in the city. But when you look at the city's actual recent planning documents, like transportation plan, you see what I was just talking about, which is that transit and AT investments are predicted to improve mode shifting away from driving, which means throughput. The throughput of people will be improved, but that it does not mean that for those travelers still in their single occupant vehicles, that their congestion is necessarily going to improve. And so that is a very interesting conflict and tension that's raised by these policies that cities are undertaking to address Todd goals, which can sometimes conflict. All right, you'll have to wait until we produce our report to find out more about the policy steps the cities are taking to address these potential conflicts, but I just kind of wanted to whet your appetite because that's an interesting set of challenges they face. So conclusions from our research so far, what have we learned? Todd transit policymaking is widespread, but the patterns are complex in spite of, a few threads of discernible patterns that we found in terms of liberal political leanings and certain motivations. The policy adoption patterns overall really are not simple to pick apart. Many cities are making the transportation land use connection that we've been interested in investigating. So again, just to underscore that, the propensity to upzone, which can be a challenging and controversial strategy, is associated with cities that want to make improvements to mobility and accessibility. And the cities that are advancing Todd emphasize a certain policy nexus that I talked about, which includes zoning, connected to specific plans and connected to CEQA streamlining and parking deregulation. That nexus there is coming through as important. And our case studies underscore tensions and trade-offs that must be managed in this process, which is a good reason that we might interpret that finding on specific plans. If you got to work through complex and controversial, challenges, planning, not just regulation, and not just deregulation like CEQA streamlining, but planning, proactive planning becomes a part of the bargain. So we see Todd job growth can be a double-edged sword. because it facilitates VMT reduction, or it can facilitate it, and provides a fiscal means by which cities can build, support more affordable housing development. But then it also introduces concerns about displacement of low-income residents. So you've got this balancing act that cities have to try to pull off. And then again, that other trade-off that I mentioned is that strategies to enhance accessibility through multimodal transport improvements may not improve auto mobility, and thus can generate conflict. And when I say conflict, I mean, for example, lawsuits that have been filed against City of LA's transportation plan for this very reason, because of basically sort of like, you promised to reduce traffic congestion, but now you're not saying you're not. It has to do with conflicts and controversies about the use of the street by different modes, right? And how and whether people foresee a future in terms of their own travel behavior. Like, I'll support this sales tax measure to fund transit, but I'm not using transit, at least not right now. It's that kind of conflict that goes on in terms of how do we change a city and how do we address needs of residents during a change and a transition in ways that don't feel like they're making their situation worse and not better. So let's see, I'm going to end there with, again, this email address for you to send questions and comments, and I'm going to try to figure out how to get the chat box to show. I believe that Kevin is going to be,
Yep.
facilitating.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for your presentation. We did get a few questions, so I can ask the questions. So don't forget, if you have any questions, don't forget to email them to planning.horizons@dot.ca.gov. The first question we got is from the Division of Transportation Planning. The question says, is there any current findings or ongoing studies in transportation planning for affordable TODs? I think this is an area where a wealth of data and opportunity for California alternative housing and transportation modes to be identified.
Right. Well, I mean, what I know about is the work that's extensive, great work that's been done at UC Berkeley by the Anti-Displacement Project, looking at gentrification and displacement patterns in across California cities, doing case study research as well as more generalized quantitative analysis of the incidence of gentrification and displacement, which is not a totally direct answer to your question, because I think what you're asking about is sort of like, where are they making it work? And some of the case study work that has been done there at the Anti-Displacement Project does try to get into sort of the ways that in various TOD areas, resident activism has affected results. I mean, that's certainly proving to be true in the case study cities that we're looking at, where residents have definitely had an effect on, for example, inclusionary housing requirements in specific plans. And again, it's just, there's a balancing act, because a lot of the cities feel like they do want market rate housing, not just affordable housing. And I mean, when you get strategies like you're seeing in San Francisco, Chinatown, Mission, where it's like they're kind of putting a moratorium on commercial, the question still becomes, what kind of housing is feasible, and how many units of affordable housing can you build in a city where the land prices are so high? And so that's kind of a long-winded way of saying I wish there was more work being done, and the best work I know about is specifically on on how to make TOD strategy equitable. I would refer you to, but that work by the Anti-Displacement Project. It's a couple of years old now, and so I don't know about current research underway. I mean, that's part of our analysis. You know, it's part of what we're looking at. But
Great, thank you. We have another question. This is a 2-3-part question. This question also comes from the Division of Transportation Planning. The question, it says, thank you for your presentation today for this important topic. Your study surveyed the 4 largest metro areas in the state. However, California is a large and diverse. What about the other large areas of the state that are ex-urban or rural and typical resource base, such as based on agriculture, forest products, and recreation industry? Would you predict similar results and findings in those areas in terms of TOD support? If not, what does your work suggest about how state agencies like Caltrans can promote the objectives of TOD in rural areas? That is VMT reduction, GHG emission reduction, and higher density / transit oriented residential development.
Okay, well, nothing like asking me to speculate on a topic I have not been directly but it's of course an important one. And we had originally intended to do the survey statewide, but in the negotiation process over the final project scope, they rightly pointed out that we were being overly ambitious, and we had to, I mean, so it was not our original intention simply to look at the large urban regions, but and it's obviously an important question. I mean, for example, it's absolutely on the table when it comes to 375 implementation, isn't it? Like how, because you often hear the Central Valley MPOs saying, you know, what you talk about for downtown San Francisco does just not translate well out here in you know, or if you complain that, you know, the city needs to facilitate TOD, well, we can upzone to the sky. That doesn't mean there's market interests here, out here, you know, in our Central Valley city. So those are real important questions. Now, I mean, you know, just based on my observation of other research done by others, I mean, in terms of this, like on 743 and so forth, I mean, just because you're not going to have a skyscraper, you know, in your city doesn't mean there aren't TOD approaches or strategies that might not be relevant. I mean, 743 is now hitting in a way that makes this very question right on the table for, you know, a city, let's say, located out in the Central Valley, where there might be more market interest in subdivision development on the fringe than there is downtown. But from what I've heard, and again, I'm really speculating, it's not that clear cut. You are getting some market interest. It's not, it may not be a skyscraper, but you are getting some market interest in many of the smaller, you know, more rurally located cities. And you know what? I think it also gives our state a way to start thinking about this question. The problem with LOS is we didn't have to think about this question. LOS actually forced us in the other direction. It made infill harder. It penalized infill. When that was the main standard we were using, especially under CEQA, for crying out loud, you know. So if you're putting in a new subdivision at the edge of, you know, the urban zone, becomes very important to think about how to make TOD work in that context, to build in locally serving retail, for example. And of course, that's happening in many places. It's just that I think that under 743 now, finally, you know, as well as 375, but 743 in particular, cities are really going to have to think about that. And it isn't one size fits all. I mean, our research is looking more at the urban context, of course, you know, and I hope that other really good work is done to look at it, not just out, let's say, in the Central Valley, in a major city in the Central Valley, but in suburban contexts that were built as residential as bedroom communities. Those are critical questions, and so, you know, within the 4 large urban regions, that's why we did, you know, definitely investigate these questions of how, you know, lower density versus higher density, low transit access versus high transit access cities do they differ? You know, can we see real differences? But that's where my finding about the complexity comes in. Again, we didn't see those simple patterns. I mean, if you could see our survey is confidential, so you can't, but if you could see the list of cities that met the criteria I showed you on that slide, they're the aggressive TOD policy adopters with the, you know, accessibility, mobility goals. It does not just look like, you know, the major central cities. It's a surprisingly diverse array of cities by size and, you know, sort of location in the urban rural continuum. So that is the reason that I was underscoring that there aren't simple patterns. TOD policymaking, for whatever reasons, I mean, is actually widespread across cities of different types. Doesn't mean there aren't cities that lack interest, because of course we found that too, right? We found only 2/3 of respondent cities say they've adopted any policies to support TOD, right? It's just that the ones who have aren't just your usual suspects, is kind of what I'm getting at. I hope that answers your question. Basically, you're right. We should have done the Central Valley. We felt we didn't have the resources.
Great. Thank you, Elisa. Let me check to see if we have any more questions coming in. No questions at the moment. Is there anything you'd like to add, Elisa?
Well, thank you all for joining in. I have no idea how many of you are out there. I can't see you, but whoever's out there, thanks for joining, and please do feel free to contact me. It's esbarber at ucdavis.edu.
Great. Let me check one more time before we conclude. No questions. Okay. I'd like to thank our presenter, Dr. Elisa Barbour, for presenting today today's Playing Horizons. That concludes today's Playing Horizons presentation. Don't forget to tune in next month, Playing Horizons. And thank you to everyone that joined us today. Thank you so much.